Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 15 of Opening Basics. Today I wanted to start taking a look at the E4, E5 openings, beginning with the King's Gambit accepted. So let's put the first few moves on, E4, E5. To talk a little bit about the landscape of E4, E5 moves, these are collectively known as the open games, although one of the main lines is actually the closed Ruy Lopez, so there's no guarantee you'll get an open game by playing these, but that's the name for all of these openings. And they are, a lot of them are openings that lead to open lines. Basically, both sides have put a pawn in the center, and the pawn is undefended, so it can come under immediate attack. And so that combination leads to lots of tactical possibilities. These openings go back to the beginning of the modern game of chess, which arose in the 15th century in Europe, and some of the earliest books we have from the 16th century discuss these openings extensively, and King's Gambit was a great favorite. In addition to the King's Gambit, the five main moves here are knight f3, just developing a piece and attacking the pawn, f4, the King's Gambit, also attacking the pawn from this square, although with an unprotected pawn, so black can just take it. There's also knight c3, the Vienna game, bishop c4, the bishop's opening, and d4, the center game. And so we'll eventually take a look at all of these openings. But this video, I went to erase that. This video is just going to be about the move f4, the King's Gambit. And not only that, we're going to restrict it to the King's Gambit accepted. Black has other replies here. He can play bishop c5 to decline the gambit, or he can play d5 to offer a counter gambit, the Falkbeer counter gambit. But we're looking at the King's Gambit accepted, so this position. Now there's two main moves for white here. There's the bishop's gambit with the bishop coming out to c5, or the traditional way of playing the main line with knight f3. So let's c4, I should say. Let's take a look at bishop c4 first, because it will illustrate some tactics that are common in these King's Gambit positions. One thing I wanted to say is that there's a huge number of variations in the King's Gambit. I won't be able to cover anything near like all of them. But I'll give you a few main lines. I'll give you the names of some of the key openings and hopefully illustrate some tactical themes. And then beyond that, you just need to get out there and play them yourselves and get some experience with them. They're very interesting. They give rise to positions that don't occur in other openings, and they're very tactical. You get into concrete positions right away, so you can't rely on general rules like develop your knights before your bishops and put your pawns in the center and that kind of thing. Now you really have to calculate the concrete variations. And so this is a good example. The bishop c4 develops a piece with maybe intentions of attacking on f7 later, but black can counterattack. He's got the move queen to h4, check. And it's important to note that you can't play g3 in this position, because pawn takes g3 is really dangerous. You've set up a discovered attack on the king, and you can't take the pawn. White can't take the g3 pawn because the rook is hanging. It's a pin on that pawn. So black is just winning in this position, so you have to be careful. But this is a main line, actually, of the bishop's opening. The king just goes to f1. Says, okay, what's happening next? So it's black's turn to move. The ball is in his court. He can play g5. That's, I think, the main move here to support the pawn. He can try a developing move. You have to be careful. Knight f6 is a move you want to play, but it does block the retreat of the bishop. And after knight f3, the queen drops back to h6 here, holding on to the pawn. It's probably a good square for the queen. And this kind of illustrates one of the points about the King's Gambit. It's tactical in nature, and both sides have problems. White's problem is the king is a bit exposed over here, and the rook has not got an easy route into the game, although maybe he can push on with h4. Those are his problems. One of his advantages is that he gets a lot of center control. This sacrifice has pulled a pawn away from the center, so he can put another pawn in the center, get a lot of control of the center and space, and he gets easy development for his pieces, except for this bishop, which is a bit hemmed in. So black's advantages are this extra pawn, which it's more than just material. It's actually controlling some important squares, which is why you often see the move g5 to hold on to that pawn, and it helps prevent this bishop from getting into the game. And other than that, black has a fine pawn structure so far. He can just develop a bishop and castle. So he's got some prospects, and in this position, actually, black is slightly better. So this is one of those cases where you just hold on to the pawn and try and weather the storm. If we back up, I guess in this position, knight f6 is not the main move. The main move here is g5, just defending the pawn that way, and then white usually will develop knight c3 or d4 and just continue with his strategy of controlling the center and building up for an attack on the king. And eventually he's going to play a move like knight to f3 to chase the queen away. So that's how that might continue. And it illustrates some typical themes. But the main move here, after e takes f4... Oh, let's back up. I guess I should mention one or two things about this. Bishop c4. Queen h5 is not the main move. The queen h4 check is not the main move here. The main move is actually d4, which is also another very common idea in these openings. You want to open a line for your pieces quickly, and you're willing to sacrifice a pawn. It also puts the bishop on a bit of a vulnerable square, so you can follow up with knight f6, either here or maybe on the next move, and try and exchange off this good attacking piece with your knight. Actually, the line goes from here: queen h4 check, king to f1, and now knight to f6 can be played, or g5, g5, knight f3, queen h5. This is the line, and then h4. Going after the pawns, so trying to get the rook into the game and trying to undermine the pawns. And the queen on h5, notice, is defending the f7 square, which is important because this knight can hop into e5 and help gang up on that pawn. So a tricky position. Let's see, it's black's turn to move. Bishop to g7 is a move here. Yeah, bishop to g7 is an interesting idea. On this diagonal, it helps control the e5 square and prevent the knight from hopping into these squares. So these are the kind of thoughts you need to be thinking about when you're playing these King's Gambit position. For both sides, you have to think about your moves and your opponent's moves. So let's go back. I wanted to take a look at the main line. The main line is knight f3, and then g5, holding on to the pawn. Now g5, again, is not the only move. There is an interesting idea here with the bishop to e7, which is tempting at first. I'll go ahead and put it on the board. Bishop e7, bishop c4 developing. And the idea is, even though the knight is defending this square, you can still get in that queen check by playing bishop here check. And if the knight takes, the queen comes in with a check. But the king can just step aside, king f1. And this turns out to be okay. This bishop eventually is going to wonder what it's doing there and will retreat. So that's another way you can play. But the black player is playing for an advantage. Probably the move g5 right here, which is also the main line, is the way to try and get the strongest advantage. And you'll find many classical games from this position. White can play bishop c4 here, or he can immediately counter with h4. So h4 is the main line again, and it prompts the move g4. So it's accomplished something. It's weakened the f-pawn, so now this bishop has hopes of coming out with a single move and grabbing the f-pawn, but it's attacking this knight, and what do you do with the knight? So there's two knight moves to consider here. The knight could go to g5 or to e5, and knight to e5 is the main line. That's known as the Kieseritzky Gambit. If the knight goes to g5, this is known as the Allgaier Gambit, and this is actually a piece sacrifice. The Allgaier Gambit, notice that all these squares are covered. Well, that one's occupied. These are protected by a pawn, and these squares are all covered. So there's nowhere for the knight to go, and black can just play h6 and win a piece, which is the way it's played. And then the knight takes, king takes. And now they don't play this way in modern chess so much, at least not at the top level. But this was a very hot line back in the 18th century, the Allgaier Gambit. And white gets a lot of activity for his piece. Notice these pawns now are kind of loose. So the queen could take on g4 immediately. It's more common to develop here with a check. And then here's this d5 move again. Very common idea, as I mentioned, pushing that pawn up to open a line for your bishop, which now protects that g5 pawn, and just sacrificing a pawn. Remember, you're up a whole piece, and then the king can try and find safety over here on g7. A very funny way to play, and then continuing with d4, getting control of the center. The other way white can play this is the immediate d4. And similarly, the move d5 is also good here. This allows bishop takes f4, so giving up the f-pawn. But, well, black has got an open line for his bishop, and he could even consider taking on e4, although maybe developing a piece with knight f6 is the best way to play it. I mean, his naked king, his exposed king out here is going to be trouble at some point, so you probably need to get some pieces out to defend it. So those are the kind of lines you might get into with the bishop's opening. Oh no, this is the main line. Sorry, I've gone into. That's the Allgaier Gambit. So let's go back to the start of the King's Gambit, see if we can remember where we are. So it's e takes f4, and there's the main line. Knight comes out, g5 defending, h4 attacking the defender and driving it forward, and then knight e5. This is the Kieseritzky Gambit, and this is really the main line of the King's Gambit. And now black finally, he has no pieces developed. He's done nothing but pawn moves. Finally, black develops a piece, knight f6, attacking the e-pawn. And so this pawn, the g-pawn, was under threat. So the knight f6 move is not really defending the g-pawn. It's still attacked twice, but it's more about attacking the e-pawn. And white will answer with a bigger threat. He says, I'm not worried about my e-pawn. I'm going to take your f-pawn with check. And this does need to be dealt with. But now, because of the knight on f6, you can play the move d5, hitting the bishop. And if the bishop takes, you're just going to trade it off. So that will get rid of one of white's important attacking units. So what the white usually will do is take with the pawn, with the idea maybe of pushing this pawn in the future and unleashing that attack on f7. And black blocks the pawn with bishop to d6. So this is a typical kind of position you can get into from the Kieseritzky Gambit, from the main line. And it just goes on from there. It's not the end of the story by any means. Another line here, which actually I've seen more often in practice, is just d4, defending that knight for a moment. And then you kick the knight with e6, and it drops back to d3. And this is a position which also has got some interest. It's even possible to take on e4, although maybe a bit risky. Another idea here is to play knight to h5, which is an interesting move, another way of defending the f-pawn, and maybe a little bit safer way to play rather than opening up a line towards your king. Although technically knight e4 looks like the top choice in the opening book and also by the chess engine. So interesting stuff. That's the Kieseritzky Gambit. So we've talked about the Allgaier, we've talked about the Kieseritzky. Going back, there's another gambit called the Muzio Gambit I wanted to show you. So e takes f4, the King's Gambit, knight f3, main line. And now g5, defending the g-pawn. And now instead of h4, there's an option of playing bishop c4. This is pretty popular, so you'll probably see this if you're playing the main line. Once again, setting up threats, so the knight wants to come in here and gang up on f7. And then g4 immediately. You're just ignoring that threat. And what white can do here, which seems crazy. Well, first of all, let's take a look at what happens if he plays knight e5. You have a problem with queen h4 check and these advanced pawns. once again, it's not safe to play g3. So the king comes over here to f1, and then knight h6, defending on f7. So that's the way you defend f7 in the event of the immediate knight e5. Throw in the check first, and then bring the knight out to defend. So that's not so good. In this position, the knight can go back to g1, but a very popular move here, and top choice in both the computer and the opening book, is just to castle, giving up the knight. So black takes the knight, and the queen comes out, and once again white is down an entire piece, but he's got a very ominous looking threat, and now very precise defense is required to hold on. He has no pieces developed at all. A really funny position, and the first piece he's going to develop is queen to f6. Get the queen out. The queen is actually a pretty good defender, and the knight can also go to certain squares, maybe h6 to defend f7 with the help of the queen, and the bishop can come out. But anyway, crazy stuff. So that's the Muzio Gambit. So those are the main lines I wanted to talk about. Another interesting point here is Bobby Fischer wrote a famous article back in 1961 called "A Bust to the King's Gambit," and the line he was advocating was after e takes f4, knight f3, the main line. Instead of playing g5 or some of these other moves, I guess knight f6 is something you could try here as well, or bishop e7. That's the Cunningham defense. Interesting way to play. He was saying, how about just d6? What this does is it keeps the knight from coming into e5, which we saw as an important idea in some other lines. But white gets an okay game. He can play d4, and now g5 can go back into the somewhat familiar lines. But we already have the line opened for the bishop, so maybe this is slightly better, a better version for black of some of those, or maybe a safer version for black of some of those lines we saw earlier with the immediate g5. There's also bishop c4 here, and then h6, a funny move, so that both of these dark squares that the knight might hop into have been controlled by pawns. And now d4, and white has a big center, and black has made a lot of pawn moves, but he is still a pawn up. So that is another way you can play. One point I wanted to make about the main line, and I might as well mention it here, so one more chance to review the main line. So f5, f4, e takes f4, knight f3, g5, h4. You might be tempted to play the move h6 and just try and hold on to the pawns that way, but this doesn't work, and once again it's for tactical reasons. There's this pin, so that's why in this position you have to push on with g4. So I think that covers it. There are times when you want to play the move bishop to g7, if I haven't mentioned it. In addition to controlling this diagonal in the e5 square, it also protects the rook, so it can enable a later move like h6. But anyway, as I was saying earlier, the best way to get to know this opening is to get out there and play it. And keep in mind, even if you're in a position which is perhaps not theoretically the best, your opponent is not a grandmaster. And he's not going to be making the theoretically best replies to your moves anyway. So it's a good way to test your skills. Go ahead and sacrifice a piece and see if you can find that adequate compensation. Okay, that concludes this video. In the next video, I'm going to look at various other lines in the King's Gambit declined, and the Falkbeer counter gambit. So stay tuned for that. See you then. Bye.